The recent Dutch election has sent a shockwave through Europe. The anti-Islam, anti-migrant populist Geert Wilders won the most seats. But will he be the country's next Prime Minister? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Geert Wilders' win in the Netherlands adds to the list of populist leaders triumphing in European elections. What's the message that's so appealing to Dutch voters?
The music is upbeat, but the mood is somber.
I'm really flabbergasted and shocked and angry, and I feel sad about the election results.
This man's party won the most seats. He had previously campaigned on banning Qurans and mosques, wanting to leave the EU and bringing the number of migrants down to zero.
We will make sure that the Netherlands will be for the Dutch people again. We will restrict the asylum tsunami and immigration. People will have more money in their wallet again.
His party is set to take 37 seats. The combined Labour-Green ticket got 25, and the People's Party of outgoing Prime Minister Mark Rutte slid down to 24 seats. Now 76 seats is the number needed to achieve a coalition government. The Netherlands has struggled with soaring inflation, like the rest of Europe, which peaked at 14.5% in September last year. And like other populists, Wilders has blamed immigration. Now the horse trading starts. The People's Party, now led by Dylan Jesselgus, ruled out supporting Wilders as Prime Minister, though she had suggested she might before the election. Further negotiations will mean shelving both anti-Islam and anti-Europe rhetoric. The process is likely to take months, and there's no guarantee Geert Wilders will find a winning combination. But he's shown he's a political survivor and knows how to play the game.
Well, let's meet our guests in London. We have Chris Doyle. Chris is Director at the Council for Arab-British Understanding. In Enschede, in the Netherlands, Henk Van Der Kolk, Associate Professor at the University of Twente, and Ulrich Brueckner, who is Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. Welcome to you all. Henk, help me out here. I still remember this guy, Wilders, not being allowed past border control at Heathrow Airport in London because the UK government considered him too dangerous. What has happened?
A lot. I think first we should put the election result a bit in perspective. He won 22% of the vote, and that sounds far less than the 37 seats he won in Parliament in the most recent election. So that's putting it in perspective. But on the other hand, he is now the biggest party. He's by far the most right-wing party that won so many seats in Parliament. And everyone was stunned by the result, meaning no one expected such a big win for this political party. So that's what happened.
Henk, were you surprised yourself?
Yeah, very much. It was the campaign dynamics that produced the outcome. During the campaign, migration became more and more the dominant theme. Wilders was always seen as the politician focusing on that theme. And the right-wing political parties, the moderate right-wing political parties, started considering Wilders during the campaign as an acceptable coalition partner, not expecting that he would win the large majority in that, prospective coalition.
I saw a phrase he kept using, that he was going to give the Netherlands back to the Dutchman. Do you think, Henk, that's what he wants to do, or that's what people bought into?
In a way, yes. I think migration became the big theme in this election campaign, and people felt that they were unable to control. I mean, I'm speaking about the feelings of the electorate of Geert Wilders, that they were unable to control the influx of immigrants, not only asylum seekers, although he most often mentions asylum seekers, but also students and migrant workers coming from all over Europe. So people have the idea that they are no longer in control of their country. At least a large part of the electorate has that feeling.
Ulrich, across the European Union, in Germany where you are, How has this result been received?
Well, everyone I talked to was really shocked because I think it was Wilders included who was surprised by the result. When you saw his physical reaction in the election night, he was kind of shocked. Now, what am I going to do now? It was a bit like Nigel Farage on the morning after the Brexit referendum. So these are people who lead a life of protest. They are against something, but they don't really have an agenda to deliver a solution for what people who are not just protesting against something want as an alternative to what apparently the establishments are not willing or able to deliver. And when we look into the general pattern, although every country is different, then we can identify two trigger points. The one is something is unfair, and we are living in times in which people have a very strong sense about what used to be the natural order of things, and in this order, what is fair, and if this is changing, then they feel challenged and provoked. And the other thing is about insecurity, which also has a lot to do with change, in which we cannot take certain things for granted. And my country, and that's also the same with the Netherlands, enjoyed a very long time of prosperity in which things got better and better until they don't. And so there is a reason to be unsatisfied with especially what governments that are in power for long term, like Rutte or Merkel, represented, and then change or investment in what needs to be addressed to be ready for the future messed out. And then we have a situation in which populists could benefit from this.
Chris, in London, not that long ago, the Home Office of the British government viewed this guy as, their words, dangerous. His thoughts, his ideologies, his interviews, everything he had said, they didn't want to actually allow him into the UK. And now he's won the Dutch elections.
Well, this should be a massive wake-up call across Europe in European politics, because the far right have been gradually chipping away in so many countries. We see the far right propping up the current Finnish coalition. Remember that Marine Le Pen came second in the French presidential election with a very similar proportion of the vote in the first round in April of last year. And we see the far right doing well in Austria, in Slovenia. Of course, there are some areas where, in some countries where this hasn't always been the case. There's been a few setbacks, but largely this tendency where anti-immigration views, anti-Muslim views, anti-EU views have become much more mainstream. And even if they don't necessarily win, they've dragged the conversation to the right. It's made typically mainstream traditional parties more of the right. And that certainly happened in Britain. To see off the threat from Nigel Farage that Ulrich mentioned, the Conservative Party became far more anti-immigration. We came up with this bizarre plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda. In Britain, we may not have a far-right party quite of the same, but it is pretty far-right, and it's very anti-immigrant, and it indulges in Islamophobia.
Henk, when we think of the Netherlands, famously tolerant people, the world over, you meet anyone who has met with Dutch people, visited your country, they would say you are very, very tolerant. And yet here is a guy who has said what he has said about Islam and the Quran and mosques. And I wonder how Muslim people in the Netherlands are feeling this week.
It's not easy to give a simple answer to that seemingly simple question. Also because not only, let's say, native Dutch people voted for Geert Wilders, also some Muslims admitted they voted for Geert Wilders. So the support for Wilders does not really stem from a coherent ideological frame, from a coherent group of people. These are not all right-wing extremists that vote for Geert Wilders. I think it was mainly the theme of migration, and also the theme of the government should care for our people instead of making all these mistakes that are made in the past decades. And these 2 points are supported not just by the right-wing people in the Netherlands, but is a more broadly shared feeling. So I think that is an important note to make. We should not consider this electorate to be a homogeneous group all having right-wing extremist ideas. But you're right, I think that quite some groups feel under threat because the positions taken by Wilders are really extreme. Having an extra tax for those wearing headscarves, banning the Quran, banning Muslim education, etc. And some people have expressed that they feel under threat now. And that is something that, well, we'll have to wait and see what happens in the upcoming weeks. It may be that there is no coalition possible with Geert Wilders, and then we will have again a center-wing center coalition. So currently there is not a strong feeling because we do not know what will happen in the upcoming weeks. He won the election, but he's not in the government yet.
Henk, amazing point you make that some Muslims actually voted for Wilders.
Yeah, because Wilders' actual positions are not always that well perceived by part of the electorate, or they do not really take him serious. The same thing you see in Trump, for example. Not everyone takes Trump serious in all his positions. And that's what also happened with Geert Wilders, especially during this campaign, because some right-wing political parties, center-right-wing political parties, made him an acceptable person. They didn't take all these attitudes towards the EU, for example, or even banning the Quran very seriously. They saw it more as an expression of a feeling than as an actual policy proposal. So that's why also some Muslims that also see that there is not enough housing, for example, in the Netherlands to house immigrants, refugees, etc., that they stressed that point. And they think, well, let's ask for a right-wing politician with a seemingly clear alternative. Let's see what he's going to do, and let's ignore all the other aspects of his policy proposals.
Ulrich, how concerned should we be now about the rise of populist right-wing leaders across European Union countries, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, and now this seismic result in the Netherlands?
Well, of course, it's tempting if we have 27 countries to find examples that define a trend. But I would disagree slightly from what Chris said, because if we put it in a bigger context, then a lot of conservative countries moved further to the left. And what used to be a conservative party in Germany, the CDU under Merkel, became a centrist party. So with all these changes, the pendulum might swing a bit further to the right. But the overall development has been as Europe became much more open society and pluralist oriented. And now people are afraid of maybe this is going too far. And we also have to rethink what the long-term consequences are. In the short run, when we look at the European Union agenda, the biggest challenge, what is ahead of us, is further enlargement. And we can only further enlarge with new members from the Balkans or even beyond when we discuss Ukraine and Georgia is possible if we reform the European Union. And we have seen a pattern of populist leaders that they show a much larger appetite in blackmailing the European Union, no matter if they have a specific interest in something, they just blackmail because they are more interested in short-term benefits. And that is actually very frightening for the functioning of the European integration process.
Chris, the European Union wants to get bigger. Wilders is on record as saying he wants the Netherlands to have a referendum on leaving, an exit, a Netherlands exit. Given your experience of Brexit and the state it has left the United Kingdom in, what advice would you give the Dutch?
Well, I think what we have seen in Britain is that more and more people have actually come to regret. They've got buyer's remorse in terms of Brexit. It was, of course, a very close vote in the referendum of 2016 in Britain. I think most people woke up astonished that we voted no. And as I understand it, but of course I look at Henk here, I don't think there's any real chance that Netherlands would vote for an exit. And Wilders himself is pretty much admitted as such. Anyhow, I think that, although he's promised a referendum, I think it's very unlikely. But then again, it is a challenge for the EU because it's not just in the Netherlands that there is anti-EU sentiment. And Ulrich is right, that the EU has some challenges, is not always seen as delivering for the population of the European Union. And that's one of the reasons why, Britain left and a lot of people didn't feel comfortable with remaining part of the EU. These criticisms shouldn't be just dismissed. They've got to be taken on board and addressed. As pro-European as I am, we have to acknowledge some of the weaknesses. The feeling of disconnect between Brussels and the populations around the continent, I think, is very serious. And people will vote for whatever reason for some of these far-right parties, and not because they buy into all of its ideology. But it's a very dangerous position. I mean, we've seen on this continent when people have voted for far-right parties, not necessarily believing what they wanted to do, and then finding out how bad it gets later on. So it's a very, dangerous situation if you empower these sorts of people, if we indulge in populist policies where expertise is not really valued, we don't really try to resolve the challenges in a sophisticated and effective fashion. And of course, it's not just a European problem. We could face the prospect, of course, of having Donald Trump returning to the White House at the beginning of 2025, and that's down the line. And what further boost will that give to right-wing populists in Europe and elsewhere? So we have a big challenge. We have to face up to it. And part of that is being seen that governance has to be better, have to be more effective in making sure people aren't left out, aren't marginalized, aren't on the extremities of society.
Henk, it seems almost unimaginable to have a European Union without the Netherlands. What's your prediction of Nexit? Would there be a referendum? What would the Dutch people say?
First of all, there is no institutional structure to have a referendum. So I'm not very afraid of having a referendum on a Nexit. Secondly, although you never know in politics, but I think that such a proposal will be rejected by a large majority, even of Geert Wilders voters. Unlike Britain, the Netherlands is part of the mainland. All our borders are with the future European Union. I don't think that anyone will see a viable future for the Netherlands without the European Union. So I'm not yet very afraid for that.
Ulrich, do you think the European Union needs to look at this result, as much as some people will laugh at Wilders, that the EU needs to start thinking, we need to up our game to nip this in the bud?
Well, I think everybody takes it very seriously, not necessarily as the worst case scenario that Wilders will become prime minister and then do outrageous things, like if a referendum would be technically possible, to find a way to guide a founding member out of the European Union. But there is a lot of potential for major accidents, like what we see on the 9th of June next year is something that is totally unpredictable what the context is, in which protest voters simply look for something to an alternative. And the leading country parties in Germany are all perfectly in line with European integration. And at the core of our pluralist system is that you have a choice. And if the only alternative to what mainstream parties believe is good for us, which means further integration, then those who are not fully convinced would rather go for an alternative. And if in times of social media, we do not only form an opinion, but the opinion forms us, then these two challenges to the functioning of our democracy can have collateral damages in the next European parliamentary elections, and that will have a major effect on the European Union.
Chris, we've got elections coming in the United Kingdom as early possibly as spring 2024. Do you think right-wing politicians, far-right figures in Britain will be looking at the Netherlands and thinking, yes, we can do something here?
I suspect not, if I'm being honest. I think that the election here will largely be determined by the economy. Already well before the elections in the Netherlands, culture wars had already been a big issue where politicians on the right have been trying to play this and create wedges between varying communities, particularly using anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigration sentiment. So it's already there. They may be a little bit encouraged by the results in the Netherlands, but I'm not sure too hugely it's going to really impact the elections. And the trouble for the right in Britain at the moment is that the Labour party of the left is well ahead in the polls, and it's very difficult to see how that's going to be changing. I suppose one thing that is similar to the Netherlands is that you have a Conservative Party that's been in power for 13 years. It's been a long time, and I think people want to change. And I think, from what I'm hearing from Henk and everybody else in the Netherlands, that was very much part of what went on in that vote, a desire for change. So I think Britain will have its own electoral dynamics. There may be some similarities, but it won't be necessarily affected.
Henk, in terms of what happens next, it took 299 days to form a government, famously, in the Netherlands last time. I mean, we might be meeting up next year on Roundtable discussing what's happening still.
True, yeah. So, I think that every political scientist claiming that he or she knows what will happen in the upcoming months is lying, because we do not know. It may take a few weeks. I don't expect that. It may take 3 months, 4 months, so a reasonable amount of time. That may be possible, but I expect it to take a very long time before a coalition is formed, because the other coalition parties need to show that they did their utmost best to make sure that Wilders is not going to do anything he wrote down in his party platform. And they will make sure that every opportunity Wilders sees in the upcoming years, if a coalition is formed, is blocked beforehand. So I think that will take an awful long time, although the current person in charge of forming the coalition said it is just a matter of a few weeks. But I don't expect that will turn out to be true.
And your prediction, Henk, do you think he will eventually become Dutch Prime Minister, or is he so toxic the coalition forces will dictate that he can't stand?
I really don't know. I mean, the night of the election, the day after, I said this is unimaginable. But within a few hours, I started to shift my thinking, and I can imagine that is what will happen in the Netherlands too. At this moment, I can't imagine he will become a prime minister for all the reasons mentioned here, anti-Muslim, which is a large part of the Dutch population, anti-EU, he has to do the negotiations in the EU. So I can't imagine, but I couldn't imagine the outcome of the election either, and that happened too, so maybe.
Ulrich, I mean, he channels a lot of Trump energy, doesn't he? White shirts, red ties, big shock of blonde hair, outlandish policies and interviews. Is this what we're going to see more of, do you think, going forward? These kind of Trumpian characters pushing themselves forward?
Well, I think every country has its own style and taste. When we just remember what happened with Italy, Meloni used a very Italian-like form, not with red ties, but everyone was very afraid of what happens if. And then the beauty of the European integration project is that we are so heavily interconnected and interdependent that it's one thing what you can say during an election campaign, and what you can actually do if you don't want to risk that the markets will punish you instantly is something very different. And that is sort of the wishful thinking for the worst case that Wilders will become prime minister. In the end, it's just a country within the European Union network, and there is a lot of checks and balances to rely on.
Chris, just looking ahead to 2024, if he does become prime minister, I'm struggling to think of any other European leader who has not been allowed into the UK. So the British government might have to backtrack a bit if this guy suddenly has to come to London, say, to meet whoever happens to be in Downing Street.
Well, I think that, he will be, the leader of the Netherlands, the prime minister of the Netherlands, and there is, diplomatic immunity and so forth. So I very much doubt a British government will block him again. But obviously there will be a lot of concerns. I suspect they won't be necessarily wanting to line up, next to him all too readily. It depends on the, sounds and noises he makes as leader. But I'd also just add this. He might be more dangerous not being prime minister, where others will have to take over. He'll be lurking there with this, having got the largest number of seats, and he'll be able to blame them for all that goes wrong and could actually do even better at the next elections. Actually, being in power brings responsibility. You actually have to demonstrate some success. So it might be actually more dangerous if he's not actually prime minister. But the rest of the world will have to deal with Wilders if he's prime minister, and they will, because people aren't going to ignore the Netherlands. We didn't ignore Donald Trump, despite, remember him, and he was the one who wanted to ban all Muslims entering the United States. But of course, we had a relationship with him, even if it was rocky.
Chris, Henk and Ulrich, thank you all so much for your time on Roundtable. That's all we have time for. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.